My name is Syed, as introduced. I'm the product lead for cloud and endpoint security in Cisco. So let's begin. So if you take a look at the past year, you might have heard a lot about the ransomware that has hit various organizations globally. Some are really big ones that went into the news, things like Colonial Pipeline, which impacted the everyday people because there was a gas shortage in the east coast of the US, and people started rushing into the gas stations. And this was really because of a ransomware attack, and the CEO made a decisive action to really cut down the lines because they were not able to understand what exactly happened and how far of a breach they had experienced. And you might also have heard of some other ransomware, like Kaseya, for example, which hit quite a number of different organizations, big and small, and others that made the news, but maybe you were not quite familiar with it. In 2020, we saw a lot of different threats. It's to a point where we, as a Talos organization that looks at threats globally on a daily basis, we came up with this 12-month roundup to give you an understanding of the various verticals, industries, and types of malware that has come across in the past year or so. So if you want to take a look, you want to understand a little bit more, we can send out the slides later on, and you can click on this link for you to download this particular PDF. Looking at some of the ransomware myths, people know what ransomware roughly is, but there are some myths that people commonly think about, but they are not exactly true, right? As Pak Linta mentioned, we have seen a huge uptick in the number of people who were hit with ransomware and decided that the best course of action is really to pay the ransom. But a 2021 report in early 2021, it estimated that only about 8% of victims who paid the ransom got all of their data back. So remember, all of their data back, right? So they might have gotten some data back, but some of it was left out. And 29% were actually unable to recover more than half of the encrypted data, even after they have released the key back to you. So something to consider. Is paying the ransom something that is best when you are hit with ransomware? Probably not, right? And the other myth is that while we see a lot of news covering all of the big organizations like JBS, Colonial Pipeline, the likes of Microsoft, for example, who were hit with some form of malware, no organization out there is really too small for them to target. Since 2018, we have seen about 86% of SMBs actually reported being victims of ransomware, but they just did not make the news. They had to report it due to government regulations, but it didn't get into a point where everybody across the globe knew about it. So this is definitely something to take into consideration, whether your organization is big or small. The third thing is about the protection mechanisms, or more on the backup solutions. So a lot of people think that backing up data is really the best way to combat against ransomware. And this is with the thought process of, if my data is encrypted, I can wipe it and I can do a backup, right? Yes, that is true, and that is definitely one of the recommended practices. But think about the other side of the coin. We are seeing a lot of threat actors actually doing double extortion techniques, where they first encrypt your data that is visible to you, so you cannot actually access your data. You'll be thinking about backing it up, but they also actually extract your data and publish it on the dark web for sale. So if that actually happens, there's no real way for you to prevent them from selling your data out to whoever the next highest buyer, right? So backing up data is important, but it's not the best way to combat against ransomware. We need to have a layered approach, which brings us to the fourth myth, where a lot of people think that antivirus and perimeter-based solutions are really sufficient protection to protect against any malware out there. While a lot of organizations out there, big and small, they do have perimeter-based solutions. All of the organizations that were breached also had it, right? So we need to take a step back and assess what is really important for protecting our network based on what kind of threats we have seen and how they actually work, which we will cover in greater detail in the next few slides. And the last piece is about the fact that when you see your data being encrypted, that is where the attacker actually made access into your network. The fact is that by the time the attack is executed, the criminals have been sitting in your network for months, and we need a way to reduce the time to detect. Right? Because lots of information can actually be stolen before they actually encrypt your data and ask you for the ransom. So let's take a look at a common ransomware that has hit multiple organizations. So this kind of process for Lockbit specifically, this came from an interview with a Lockbit ransomware operator. So the Talos team actually got hold of one of the guys who was willing enough to do a closed door interview, and they explained the process of how this particular ransomware actually works. It works in 4 stages. Firstly, the social engineering aspect, where there is the information gathering. So they typically use tools that are commonplace, things like LinkedIn, Zoom Info, or credentials that have been lost in the dark web, to gather information about their next potential target. The reason why they want to do this reconnaissance phase is really because when they understand what kind of organization and who to best target, it really ups the level of efficiency for them to breach that particular organization. Once they get the information that they require, they then start to scan. They are utilizing tools that are commonplace in most organizations today, that are legitimate tools that are being used by software that every organization is using today. Things like MassScan, Nmap, and other add-ons like Rascan are used to find the externally facing domain space and IP block of the victim's network so that they can then send across their ransom. The next thing is to utilize login. Right? So out of all of the breaches that have been assessed in the past few years, and upwards of 86% of those breaches actually come from already compromised accounts. So people who have lost their username and password, and this is sold in the dark web for a not very expensive price. So if they get access to users' logins, it is really the first step for them to get into somebody's network once they have scanned and understand the IP address block. Once they have gone in, they then do the exploit phase, right? So this is where the C2 communication and key exchange actually comes in, where the operator pivots from one device that they have gotten access to typically by exploiting a known vulnerability, and then they pivot into a more privileged access like an administrator device, right? So in this particular ransomware, which is Lockbit, they actually utilize Windows protocols to obtain the hashed password. They extract that password out, and then they pivot across to the next more privileged user. Only then would they do the execution phase, where they do it in multiple stages. So an obfuscated stager is dropped into the RAM. They do it in the RAM because at this point in time, the user doesn't know that he's breached, right? So in case he does restart his device, it will still be in part of the device. And from there, they sit in the network for months trying to collect as much information as possible. They extract this periodically so that it's not something that is alerted by the organization. And after they have extracted enough data, that is where they do the encryption phase, where they encrypt the files, and the user actually sees that they have been breached and then requests for ransom. So if you take a look at this, there is a whole process behind how a user starts his reconnaissance all the way to the encryption phase. And within this time, if you are not able to detect it, there's a lot of data that actually has been lost already. And this is actually what happened to Accenture. So Accenture is a very big organization that was hit by Lockbit in the recent months. So you can see the date over here, August 17th, 2021. They were hit quite hard by this, right? And from here, they then had to do some mitigation. If you take a look at the evolution of ransomware, it's interesting as well, right? So while defenses have evolved, there's a lot of evolution with regards to ransomware itself, from the targets that they are doing. Like Pak Linta mentioned, in the past, they only actually targeted endpoints and data repositories. Today, they know a lot of people are using cloud, they're moving their workloads to the cloud, they're using virtual machines and containers, and they're accessing or taking advantage of all of the different exploits or vulnerabilities that are part of these different targets. The attack vectors as well. In the past, ransomware has been around for a long time. They typically came in from phishing emails or web exploits. Today, they can go through compromised user accounts. They do drive-by downloads. They access, they exploit vulnerabilities in different applications, whether it's SaaS-based or different workloads that you have hosted, so on and so forth. So many different threat vectors that are out there for them to come into your environment. In terms of the tactics, in the past, most of the ransomware is typically quite standard in terms of how they come in and how they kind of move across east-west within your network. Today, they are leveraging a lot of the more sophisticated tools that are being used or embedded in different software people are using today. Things like live off the land techniques or native operating system and application tools are being utilized as part of the whole ransomware ecosystem. The threat actors themselves, usually it was the threat actors, the evil people, right, who created the ransomware and wanted to breach into somebody's organization. Today, it can be almost anyone. And the reason is because they are now termed as ransomware mercenaries, right? They are selling the ransomware as part of a service so that you don't have to have the actual expertise to create the ransomware. You just have to have a desire to breach into somebody's network. And in terms of ransom terms, now in the past, it used to be just you pay, we decrypt your data. Of course, that's not guaranteed. But today, they're doing double extortion techniques. You pay, we decrypt your data, but whether you know it or not, they can actually sell your data to the next highest bidder. So this is where we get into some of the best practices for ransomware defense. There are three kind of fundamental steps. The first thing is what you do before. The first thing in the before phase is really to build out this layered defense. If you understand the different threat vectors that are out there, there are multiple points in how a threat actor can actually come in. You would need to have some form of EDR solution, not just antivirus, so that you can contain and remove the threats as quickly as possible. We need to be looking at email security from all of those phishing emails that will still typically come through. Web security in a sense where it covers multiple different feature sets as part of somebody going out to websites, whether internet or SaaS-based solutions, and to add in a layer for multi-factor authentication just in case somebody's login credentials have been compromised. You need to have those additional challenges in place so that you know that the user is who he says he is, coming from a trusted device that is free from vulnerabilities. The next thing is to have a security posture and a process in place for cyber hygiene. So if you think about the kind of process you want to have, this is not related to products, but more of understanding your environment and keeping up to date with things like patches. You need to have regular risk assessments to identify security vulnerabilities, map them out to those NVEs, and patch them as quickly as possible. If you understand the different protocols or network traffic that is coming through from within your environment, you should be retiring all of the insecure protocols, things like ClearText RDP or SMB version 1, version 2, so that this cannot be exploited. And on top of that, you would want to try and baseline your network so as to understand what is normal in terms of traffic movement from on a day-to-day basis and monitor those abnormal behaviors. When something does eventually happen, you want to be able to identify the impact, not just blocking the threat. Of course, blocking the threat is important, whether it is a known threat or a zero-day threat, and there are protection mechanisms like the EDR solution to do so based on behavioral analysis. But we want to also identify the impact of how this came across in your network, from the point in time where it came in to understanding who was the first person to hit, how did it spread across from within your network with regards to lateral movement, and understand a detailed timeline so that you can report this up to your various stakeholders and understand more holistically what actually happened, and then update those threat feeds that you have so as to ensure that this does not happen again. Right? So while all of this information is being collected and you're assessing what actually has happened, you also need the capability to isolate those infected machines and collect information like forensic data, event logs, as comprehensively as possible and ingest it into a centralized solution so that it's easy for you to correlate all of the different contexts. The fourth step is to analyze forensic data, right? So once you have all of this information in place, you want to really understand what that malware actually does, right? Not just what it did to your organization, but what it actually does. So have the capability to perform dynamic malware analysis through a sandboxing solution so that you can uncover additional artifacts like what domains it reached out to, what IP address it reached out to, and what are the various file hashes that it is related to. Right? This is really to prevent future attacks. And the last piece is, of course, backup solutions. So backup is still important. I wouldn't say that it is not important. It is still really important because this is a way for you to recover your data just in case your protection mechanisms don't actually block off the ransomware or fail to detect the ransomware.